Eek. Lovely. That's interesting. Okay. Alrighty. I think if I turn on the microphone, I've got everything going. I've changed the battery in the microphone twice already, but we'll see how this goes. Okay. So, all right. So today we're gonna keep talking about kind of sex and intimacy. Obviously, we're gonna move to a slightly different topic. We talked about hookup culture last time. We're gonna talk a little bit about pornography today and see where that gets us. Okay. Deep breath. Okay. All right. So just like in the way of announcements, I suppose. I am still working on the midterm. You did it a week ago, and I got a good chunk of it done yesterday. Tuesday, Thursdays are sort of I don't teach all day days, so I have a little bit more time. So I'm hoping to work on it again tomorrow, and maybe on Friday afternoon. It depends on a couple of things. So it's coming, I promise. I'll try to get it to you as fast as possible so that you have time to review it before the final exam. And all that jazz. Okay. All right. So, in terms of sex and intimacy, so we're going to jump into a new part of the topic, something that I think hopefully makes sense in some way. Pornography. Now, this slide has a funny story because with this particular unit, I try not to use too many illustrations for obvious reasons. I don't want to. Honestly, when I was doing my master's, my supervisor, who I TA'd for at University of Calgary, taught a class on porn. She's a weird person, love her to death, but an incredibly weird person. And this is a topic that she really likes, and I don't know. It was a little traumatic for me. But I remember always thinking, what kind of illustrations do you use on the slides? And I mean, so as the story goes, she would start the class with 3 straight weeks of gay porn to kind of weed out the people who, might be looking to get their jollies, from taking a class on pornography. So a really weird class. She's a really weird person, and I let us never speak of it again. That's how I'd like to remember it anyway. I did an annotated bibliography for her where I was looking up a bunch of titles of porn films and annotating them, and putting them into a bibliography for a Shirk application. And honestly, it was the weirdest project I ever did because I'm just these are weird titles. Okay, so, my other story. I have another story for this slide. The noise is back. Okay. So I'll put this up at the beginning of classes. And for whatever reason, on this particular day, and this was over in Torrey Basement, some group thought they had booked the room that my class was in at this particular time. So weirdly, my class was very full. And I walked in and I'm like, okay, that's weird. It's not exam day. Why would people be here? and before live streaming of classes, right? But still, people didn't always show up. It was scheduled from 3 to 4 in the afternoon, and it was a very weird time. And there's a bunch of people sitting there, and I go, and I'm like, okay, well, I'll put my slides up. And I put this particular slide up, and you could just see their faces be like, we're in the wrong room. And so like half the people in the class leave, which was great. But then people who were whatever event that was for, walk in late, and they come in and they go like this. They look at the slide. They realize they must be in the wrong place and something has gone wrong. And then like slowly back away, not quite understanding what's happening. So always, like, what have I stepped into? So that's my funny story for this particular bit of lecture content. Okay, kind of base stats. Now, these are a little bit old, unfortunately. I do need to update them, but I've been having trouble finding really base stats for pornography use. And one of the biggest problems is it's one of these topics that nobody really wants to talk about. People don't want to do a lot of research on it. And so we're left, kind of with loose statistics on it. It's one of the most, I would say, difficult areas to do research in social science because you get a lot of social desirability bias and, finding control groups ends up being difficult. But we can talk about that in a minute. Okay, so this particular infographic, like I said, it's a few years old. The data comes out of, this work from 2000, and is that 8 or 6? I can't tell from that slide. I think it's 2008. So yes, I can see it more clearly on my screen with a higher resolution. So this is dated, quite dated, but I think it does the job of illustrating, some of the data. It is kind of pre-smartphone, and so these numbers will have gone up in the smartphone era. Okay, so, the other thing I should say is that this particular infographic was put together by a company called Covenant Eyes. Covenant Eyes, sells filtering software, specifically, to religious people who want to monitor and control their porn use. So, take everything here with a little bit of a grain of salt. But, okay, so what does it say? Basically, 93% of boys and 62% of girls are exposed to internet porn before the age of 18. And the average age of first exposure now looks to be somewhere between 9 and 11 years old, the first time people encounter internet pornography. That's especially true of boys. Once people start getting smartphones with data, which again is around that 9 to 11 years old, one of their friends is going to show them internet porn. 70% of boys have spent more than 30 consecutive minutes looking at online porn on one occasion, and 35% of boys have done it on more than 10 occasions. Okay, 23% of girls, same statistic, right? And 14% on more than one occasion. So we see there, definitely gendered patterns, right? Where males are more likely to look at porn than females. 83% of boys and 57% of girls have seen group sex, and all the way down. I probably don't need to read you all the statistics, but I will because it's fun. Same-sex intercourse, high percentages, and again, this is usually a sort of fetishized lesbianism for heterosexual male consumption. 39% of boys and 23% of girls. Now, this statistic will actually have gone up considerably. Have some bondage, bestiality, a third of boys and a fifth of girls. 18% of boys and 10% of girls have seen rape or sexual violence. Again, that number will have gone up significantly. And we'll see in some of the more contemporary, I just spilled tea on myself. It's a good day. I hate this cup, but I couldn't find my good cup with the trigger. So I stuck with this crummy Starbucks lid and it leaks all over. All right. I thought of a pun, but I'm not going to. Okay. Only 3% of girls and boys and 17% of girls have never seen internet porn. Okay. So I will say one of the things that causes, especially that high number for boys, is in porn research, right? They've wanted to do research on the effects of pornography, right? Lab studies or panel-based studies with a control group of people who don't consume any porn. And one of the problems, they had this great big grant in the US to study the effects of pornography, and it was predicated on finding a control group, right? So a group that didn't consume pornography, and specifically young men. And they ended up canceling the study because they couldn't form a control group, right? There's like, okay, we need, basically it was like, haven't viewed pornography in the last year, and amongst college-age men, they couldn't find a large enough number of them to actually run the study. And so very famously, this study got canceled. So it is like very pervasive, right? And anything you see, right? If you ever see, a statistic, oh my God, I don't have my pen out. What's even going on? My brain is all messed up if I'm not circling things. There was a time where I didn't circle things on slides. What would I have done? Okay, a number like that, and we'll see this when we look at smartphone usage as well. That is a completely pervasive social statistic. And it's very rare, right? It's almost like, it's tremendously uncommon outside of like breathing and eating to have statistics in the 90s for any kind of social phenomenon, right? So you see the pervasive power of, of something like pornography in terms of just raw social statistics, right? And I mean, like I said, these are dated, but if anything, this number's probably gone up, right? And you're probably looking more towards like 97%, 98% in total. It's a very pervasive social phenomenon. It's just, obviously it's very easy. And this is why, you have in the US and in Canada now, people proposing to basically make it so that you have to verify your age to access internet pornography because it's become so pervasive. And the effects are not necessarily entirely positive, as I think we'll see. Okay, so we got to talk a little media theory here. Oops, I was putting a schmut off my screen. One of the discourses around pornography are really, really messed up, right? How to put this? There's a lot of assumptions and there's a lot of, I think, really unsubtle thinking around things like the effects of any kind of media on people. But I'll say the way most people discuss pornography, and this is true of a lot of media, right? Like when we start talking about violent video games or any kind of media that's a little bit controversial, we get into this kind of debate. But they're mostly predicated on a theory of media that's sometimes referred to in media studies as the hypodermic needle theory. Okay, so this is, I think, okay, let me give you some background. Okay, so back in the kind of early era of kind of mass media, right? So first newspapers, but then especially with radio and television and film, people were trying to figure out how media affected people, right? So what would consuming like hundreds of hours of a certain kind of content ultimately do to people's behavior? And though, like in media studies now, we do not talk about it in this way, this kind of view still kind of permeates. And so like this initial view was like, well, if people are consuming a certain kind of content, right, let's say violent films or sexual content, it's going to affect them in a sort of one-to-one way, right? And so the metaphor of the hypodermic needle is that basically, the medicine inside the needle is the media you consume. And it gets, the media itself is kind of injecting ideas, thoughts, and all of those things straight into your brain in this case. And like if you were injecting, any kind of medication into someone, it has a direct effect on that person, right? So it's a very kind of like sort of says a linear communication theory, right? So it's very straightforward. You consume, pornography, you start to act in the way that pornography tells you to act, right? You start to consume, you play violent video games, you become a school shooter, right? So we've all heard this kind of discourse. Now, okay, so this is generally predicated on a passive audience. The idea that audiences just take in media content and then reflect out into the world what that media content suggests. And it's a lot more complicated than that, right? And this is no individual difference, right? There's no agency in how this goes. Now, I mean, this is a really problematic theory, but it's one that still carries a lot of weight because there's a lot of, I think, really unsophisticated thinking about how media works. And if you're just thinking about, about it in passing, this model kind of makes sense, right? A person who plays more violent video games is going to be more violent. A person who consumes more pornography is going to be, sexually deviant or whatever it happens to be. I mean, all right, I'll get into this in a different class. If you're interested in like taking media theory and you're here next year, I'm teaching a class called, it's a seminar class. There's only 25 spots in it. And I don't usually advertise in the middle of the term. I really should have gotten it changed to like SOC 666. That would have been much more amusing. I'm going to have triple repeating digits. So it's 444 next year. So in the fall, Wednesdays from 2 to 5, I think. Yeah, it's a seminar class, so it's long. Anyway, if you want to, we're going to delve into all sorts of media theory, including hypodermic needle theory and some of the better theories about media. But that's a story for another time. Okay, so a lot of the arguments that people make about pornography is that it makes people violent or sexually deviant or leads to risky sex behavior or even rape, right? Yeah. Not. Yeah, so like, you know, basically porn in, porn out, if you, I don't know, like, you know, whatever you see in pornography. So if you start consuming, I'm just reading Gail Dines about this a few weeks ago. It's like stepsister porn, right, is like one of the big categories on Pornhub for some reason, according to Gail. We'll talk about her in a second too. So like if you consume a lot of that, you're going to immediately kind of reflect that back in the world, and your stepsister is at great risk, you know, or whatever it happens to be. Never understand the world. Okay. All right. So one of the really big problems too with this kind of research, and I've spent, you know, days and weeks and months reading some of the kind of academic work on this, is the effects research, is often very biased. And there's a lot of different sources of bias. One of them that you probably, well, maybe you would expect, actually. I'm going to say you wouldn't expect. A lot of the real research that people find problematic and really biased, I'm going to write it down in white, comes from feminism, right? Specifically, second wave feminism. Okay. So there can be a lot of bias in that research, and I'll talk about Gail Dines, who's probably a good exemplar of this. We can talk about Andrea Dworkin as well, you know, and Catherine McRobbie, a bunch of second wave feminists who really, really hated pornography and have been very negative on its effects for, I think, really obvious reasons. Now, on the other side, there's a whole bunch of, and an increasing body of pro-porn research that suggests all sorts of positive effects. You see some of this, you know, so I think you see a lot of this in queer theory. Queer theory has a lot of pro-porn positions, and, you know, feminism of the third wave feminism, or what you might call sex positive. I don't know why I'm writing all this, but I am. It's fun. I like annotating things. So sex positive feminism tends to have a much more positive view. So I can almost guarantee you that for every single study that claims to speak about the porns of harmography, man, I'm having spoonerist issues today. Or you mix up letters and words. The porn of harmography. No, the harm of pornography. The harm of pornography. You basically have, you know, basically almost an equal number of them refuting them or claiming that it's socially beneficial. Oh, I can't remember his name now. Oh, I read his book. And it's just escaping me. But, you know, essentially made the claim that, you know, pornography actually reduces rape because it gives people who would rape a kind of sexual outlet. Okay, anyway, that's neither here nor there. Let's not dwell on that argument too much. Okay, so Gail Dines. Gail is probably, you know, so she's what I would call a second wave feminist. And someone who is extremely critical of pornography and the porn industry, and is still super active. And I mean, I always talk about, I've met her once, she's a really interesting person, but I describe her as having possibly the worst job on earth, because she's made it her mission to just catalog, you know, what happens in pornography. And so like years ago, she would go to like adult video stores and rent whatever was in the top renter category and watch them and like do this like quantitative content analysis where she would be like, act of violence 1, 2, 3. Calling a woman a bad name, 1. And just like count them. Now she does that on Pornhub, right? She goes on Pornhub and just like watches whatever top videos are in the category and just like marks down what's in the content, which honestly I have to say, probably, I had a friend who didn't do that, but did like basically started doing research on the comments section in YouTube, and about 3 months into it got so depressed she had to switch projects because she's like, YouTube is a hive of scum and villainy. So I can't imagine what doing what Gail does, what that would do to your psychology. But anyway, she really does not like pornography. So she wrote this in the Washington Post, I guess now 6 years ago, in an editorial. You know, the thing is, this is a quote from the piece, no matter what you think of porn, harmful or harmless fantasy, the science is there. You know, 40 years of peer-reviewed research. Scholars can say with confidence that it's an industrial product, which it definitely is, right? There is a porn industry that produces pornography at an industrial scale that shapes how we think about gender, sexuality, relationships, intimacy, sexual violence, gender equality, all, she says, for the worse. There's a lot of queer theory scholars that disagree with that position and say that especially for you know, LGBTQ plus youth, that it's often the only form of sexual education they receive. But that's a different argument. Okay, using, yeah, lots of different methodologies, all the way from like surveys to brain scans, show that pornography is associated with damaging outcomes. And yeah, 83%, this is always interesting statistics. What I will say is this was a small sample size study. Researchers found that 83% of reported seeing mainstream pornography, and that those who did were more likely to say they would commit rape or sexual assault if they knew they wouldn't get caught, than men who hadn't seen porn in the last 12 months. Again, this was a small group. The same study found that porn consumers were less likely to intervene if they saw a sex assault taking place. Okay, so in a response to that particular piece, and just to drive home the point, that, you know, for every person confidently claiming they know the harms associated with pornography, someone else chimes in saying, nuh-uh. So this is Ronald Weitzer from George Washington University. You know, lots of the studies were conducted in laboratories with tiny sample sizes of college students, hardly generalizable outside of the lab context, right? Lab context studies apply to the lab conditions. They're really hard to generalize outside. And even more important, fails to mention the studies that have documented positive outcomes from exposure to porn based on surveys and interviews with consumers in the real world. And again, some of these are more sex positivity, especially amongst women. I'm going to put a sex plus. That's sex positive, not sexed. Now it looks like sex to me. I can't change it. I don't know. Maybe if I make the plus smaller. I'm going to try. At some point, either my... Oh, now I just erased it all. What will we do, Broussard? You've made a mess of things again. There we go. We're going to go with... Because it would just look like a T again. There we go. Okay, so that allows for more sex positivity, especially amongst women. You know, it's good for queer youth, right? They get to see models of queer sexuality, and that it's positive in that way. All this kind of stuff, right? So, again, I just want to stress, the body of evidence is really diverse. There's kind of pluses and minuses. For second wave feminists have tended to be the most negative, along with obviously religious conservatives. But I would actually say that the second wave feminists are more vociferously against pornography than even religious conservatives. Yeah, Mia. Sure, I could go over the second wave, the difference between second and third wave feminism. Okay, like in this context, okay, you've asked a hard question, and now you will get a long, rambling, comprehensive answer after I sip my tea. Broadly speaking, second wave feminism tends to be mostly rooted in a sort of Marxist understanding of the world, right? So second wave feminism, you would probably call it either critical feminism or conflict feminism. And so it is predicated on a really like, you know, I guess it's really focused on the patriarchy, right? Patriarchy, right? That's second wave feminism. So it has this, men against women, right? That men are the oppressors, women are the oppressed kind of dynamic to it. It also, especially in the case of the discourses around porn, and you see this in Dworkin and McRobbie, as well as Gail Dines. But Dworkin especially. Dworkin is an interesting figure because she was a prostitute. She worked as a prostitute and then later became a scholar and described, things like sex work as men commodifying women's body for their own pleasure and basically turning into a consumer product within the patriarchy. That's how she described pornography as well, right? An industrial product that allows men to turn women into the object of sexual consumption. So it's very Marxist in its orientation, right? All about how women's bodies are turned into profit centers for the patriarchy. But that's second wave feminism kind of in a nutshell, right? It really views, the patriarchy as its core concern, and especially in this sort of like Marxist framework. Okay, are you with me so far? Okay. Third wave feminism is a little bit different. It has tended to move a little bit past that. It's still concerned with the patriarchy, but it's moved past the sort of oppressor-oppressed dynamic to be a little bit more focused on women's agency and empowerment. And so one of the big discourses, especially around pornography and sex work, has been about sex positivity and allowing women to sort of approach their sexuality with as much agency as possible. And so, right, it's one of the kind of hallmarks of third wave feminism in this kind of sense is that the idea that, if women want to engage in sex work, they should be allowed to do it, right? This is always this drives people like Gail Dines absolutely up the wall and sideways, because it's basically the claim, right? You've probably heard it, right? Sex work is work, right? This kind of slogan. This is pure third wave feminism. It's like, look, there's no difference between a woman having sex on a porn set and a woman working at Walmart, right? In both cases, sorry, I've shocked Izzy with that statement. She went, but this is like the claim of third wave feminism. They might not make it that boldly, but it's essentially the claim. In both cases, a woman is selling her body to a capitalist industry in exchange for money, right? So it's all just body in exchange for money. Just in the one case, right, of pornography or sex work, maybe they get to enjoy it a little bit too, right? In terms of if they're actually enjoying the sex that they're having. So like third wave feminists will often be, or they would often prefer to be called sex positive feminists, by the way. I've slurred them with the third wave thing. They'd often be like, they're looking for ethical porn or feminist porn, pornography that depicts people in loving relationships, porn that depicts women, in genuinely enjoying sex, right? All of these things. But basically, if women want to engage in sex work, they should be allowed to. Because, right, it's just work. It's just capitalism, turning your body into money, however you choose to do that. And if you get to have sex and enjoy it, all the more power to you. Yeah, please.
I've seen a lot of discourse when it comes to pornography and the differences between men and women, which I feel like kind of reflecting stats, where women watch a lot less pornography, but they kind of have literary pornography. Like sometimes
you're thinking of the Harlequin romance novels. With the Scottish guy with the ripped abs and a kill. Yeah, no, my mother-in-law reads them. I mock her heartlessly for. Okay, the worst thing, I think I embarrassed her. It was a terrible thing to do, but she was reading it on the other side of the yard, and they have they have a lake house in Kelowna. So I was sitting like on the swing on the balcony. Are you okay, Rich? Yeah. Okay. So she's reading it out in the yard, and I was like reading it over her shoulder with binoculars. That's not going to be good. Surface down. And so I was reading it over her shoulder, and I still remember, like, God's nails, said the Duke. And I was like, okay, I've read enough. This is too much. She loves her Harlequin romances. But yes, women do consume a lot less like visual pornography than men do. Although the rates really tough thing is the rates are really hard to judge because women are also less likely to admit that they consume pornography than men are, right? It's seen as taboo for men, but even more taboo for women. But yeah, when men consume virtually no romance novels, right? It's not a thing that men seem to be interested in. And yeah, there's an argument to be said that a lot of the kind of sexual pleasure and kind of relationship. See, now I'm thinking of I could do this whole lecture differently. All right. The piece you probably want to read is Radway, and it's called Reading the Romance, where she talks about how women use these kind of romance novels to fill in for the fact that the men in their lives aren't terribly romantic in the way they want them to be, and kind of suck, and so they find the romance they're really looking for in romance novels, and it's a site of sexual pleasure for them because it describes things that they wish they could do but can't in the real world. And it gives them a break because when mom's reading her romance novel, all the kids know not to bother her, right? And who seriously don't. All of that kind of stuff. But yeah, there definitely is that kind of discord that women, because they're less visual, will read things. Again, they tend to be more focused on relationships, right? Women's porn, they tend to want to see relationships in them and loving, caring sexuality rather than bang me harder, you big stud, right? The kind of typical porn discourses that we see in mainstream pornography, right? Which is geared at men primarily. Interesting question. Did I answer it? Okay. Oh, things you never thought you'd hear your professor say, right? Alrighty. I don't even know if the Slido works anymore. I'm not going to worry about it. I don't want to answer any more questions about this topic. Why did I bring it up? Okay. I think it's important though, right? Like, given how many people consume it, it's really important. It has some interesting kind of real world effects. All right. Yeah, social psychology and research on porn has a bunch of different problems, right? One of the big ones is social desirability bias. People don't want to admit to their porn use. And if they do, they're probably not going to tell you with real honesty, even in surveys, right? Even in anonymous online surveys, what kind of pornography they watch. Because even though it's pretty mainstream, they're still kind of embarrassed about it, right? It doesn't, it's not easy for people to kind of talk about it. There's still taboos around it. Okay, yeah, randomized control tests. Now, randomized control tests are the best kind of study, right? Observational studies, I was going to write observational studies, but I'm not going to. Observational studies, which is what most of the research on porn is, right? Where you just studies where you've used basically snowball sampling or some kind of convenience sampling, much less rigorous. But randomized control tests are really hard to run because control groups are almost impossible to assemble when it comes to pornography use. Your laptop fell down. I'm sorry. There was nothing we could do. It just decided it was having suicidal ideation and leapt off the tiny desk. I hope it's okay. All right, and lab studies including brain scans, right? This is a popular one where you I don't know how they do these. They'll hook someone up to an F, it's not an MRI, is it an MRI? No, it's not. Like a CAT scan, a functional CAT scan machine, while they're watching pornography, and kind of scan their brain to see what's going on. But I mean, they have huge methodological problems. It's a lab study. It's not real world. They've done some weird shit, man. I'll tell you, the Danes, especially for some reason, at psychology. I haven't done it in a while. In this class, SOS 100 is basically just me riffing on how psychology is dumb. All right, so two major areas of concern when it comes to Pete, and they know it. So how can a real woman with pores, and all that stuff, I'm going to read the whole quote, compete with online images, let alone with speech that goes more and more, you big stud. This major Dutch study, I told you the Dutch, man, or Dutch and the Danes, found that among men, frequency of pornography viewing was associated with concern about size. The size of what? You'll have to read the quote. I heard much the same from quite a few men, that they're too hairy, not fit enough, not big enough, and they have a morose litany, right? So body image. Now, so this is for both, right? For both men and for women, body image is a big issue. Okay, so this is from a 2012 kind of literature review. done by Owens et al., The Impact of Internet Porn on Adolescence, where they basically just went through the literature and gathered some of the big trends. And you can see, I gotta switch my pen to red because, you know, white's not gonna show up on white. Yeah, so basically, participants also discussed messages inferred from sexually explicit material related to female body image. One described the theme, well, a girl should be small, thin, and, you know, inferior, while the guy should be muscular and superior, right? So porn has a certain script in terms of body image. And yeah, basically, there's a pornographic script for body type, sexual performance that's reinforced by consumption of sexually explicit material. So, right, the porn industry tends to churn out material that portrays people and sex in a particular way. And it concerns, well, not surprisingly, right, it creates unrealistic expectation and concerning expectations for both males and females who participate in this study. Men expressed insecurity about their ability to perform sexually, and women expressed insecurities about body image. And there's been people who have theorized, right, that who's this Russian scholar I was reading? I cannot remember. He was someone who had come over to the US and was commenting on gym culture, right? And again, going to the gym is great. Being in shape is great. I'm not bashing on it. But one of the things that this person suggested was that if you go to like the gyms in Czechia, you know, in Russia or in Eastern Europe, right, you have two kinds of people: women who are trying to stay thin, essentially so that they can get into a relationship where they're still seen as attractive, and middle-aged men who are trying to stave off a heart attack, right? That's who's in the gym. In North America, you've got this completely different culture of, you know, the gym bros who are trying to look like these super muscular folks. And again, nothing wrong with being muscular, nothing wrong with going to the gym. I'm not bashing on it. But the theory was that particularly pornography and the kinds of men that tend to be depicted in pornography, again, big muscular guys, is creating a script where people feel like they have to emulate that and they have to be that kind of body type, even as men. So we've tended to focus on, you know, feminine beauty standards as one of the issues, but there is a decent and increasing body of kind of research suggesting that body image issues pertain for men as well, and maybe driving things like steroid use and body image issues amongst men, trying to, you know, have these kind of idealized bodies. This one is kind of tragic, right? One female participant said she felt very unattractive. You can say that you are influenced by this, but no one can resist. You do want to have these ideal bodies, right? Okay. So, alrighty. How much time do I have left? 8 minutes. How many slides do I have left? Too many. Way too many. Oh yeah, I got Regnerus. No way I'm getting through all this today. That's okay. We'll finish on Friday. Okay, so relationships and sex behavior, right? Okay, so probably the definitive kind of researcher on this is Hebernick. Herbenik. I always get her name wrong. Who's done a ton of work on this, and broadly speaking, in terms of her kind of research orientation, has been sort of sex positive. But what essentially she and her cohorts have found, you can go look at her biography. She's a great researcher, and she's done a ton of really interesting work on this, and especially around sexual behaviors and sexual violence. Okay, so more women than men reported that someone had done something during sex that made them feel scared. So it's 12.5% of adolescent women and 3.5% of adolescent men said that happened to them, as did basically a quarter of adult women and 10% of adult men, right? So what's the really common one is choking, right? And now a lot of, this is the way it's referred to in kind of pornography, is choking, but really, you know, if you're talking about the medical definition, it's strangulation, right? So people strangling each other during sex, right? And other aggressive behaviors such as hitting, forceful hair pulling were also described among scary sexual experiences. The other one, you know, that one, I don't want to say it. This is being recorded. I'm going to get bashed by the YouTube algorithm and this video's going to get blocked already. So we'll just circle it and you can read it yourself. Okay, so that appears to have become more common, or more common as it's been more commonly portrayed in sexually explicit materials, as has strangulation. And an interest in it, right? they're all associated. So interest in this and this, greater interest with it is associated with greater pornography use. And yeah, very, I think, troubling, right? Most of the incidents of strangulation described appear to have not been discussed with partners in advance, right? Not discussed. So, I mean, if you're going to strangle someone during sex, you should probably talk about it first. Just a little pro tip. Not pro tip, what am I talking about? Just a tip, right? Probably don't just start choking someone. It's probably not a good thing. So they just started doing it. And again, this is because it's, to a certain extent, become normalized in a lot of pornography, where it just happens, so people think it's normal, right? It becomes a common form of, so being, some people worried they were being strangled because it's also a common form of intimate partner violence, especially committed against women by men, right? So it's become much more common, and this number that a quarter of adult women and 10% of adult men said that they'd experienced some kind of something that made them scared during sex, right? So that is quite a high number. Okay, so, all right. Now this from a piece on the Atlantic about the sex recession. Some studies show that in the absence of high quality sex education, teen boys look to porn to help understand sex. Now I think this is a bunch of bullocks, to be honest. Poppycock, if you will. Because I think pornography, and not because I think whether you had high quality sex education or not, teen boys are looking at pornography because it's widely available. It's alluring to them, and they're learning things from it, right? You could have the most comprehensive sex ed in the world, and they'd still be watching porn. So I mean, this is I think a bit of poppycock. Poppycock, I say. Okay. Modeling behavior after what you've seen on screen can lead also to, what's known as spectatoring, that is worrying about how you look and sound while you're doing it, which is ultimately pretty harmful. Again, so it's bad for sexual functioning. And yeah, some young women told me, or this particular person who's interviewing them, not me personally, they felt pressured to emulate porn actresses. And there's an increasing body of research. Now, this is from Abigail Schreier, and she's not the most mainstream, but the quote was really useful to me, so I took it anyway. And she's been critical of sort of transgender healthcare in particular, so take it with a grain of salt. But one of the things she found in the literature as she was researching for one of her books, and again, the quote was useful to me, so I took it, that violent porn not only terrifies young girls about men and the prospect of sex with them, it's also changing expectations and behaviors of boys. So one of the theories that's kind of going on is that, we talk about the sex recession, right? And there's that whole Atlantic article about it, that it's possible that pornography and porn viewing is having ultimately a negative effect on how much, people have sex, because young women are more frightened that what they see in pornography is going to happen to them. And so they're just choosing not to have relationships at all with young men who've been cultivated by that particular form of media. Of course.
A friend of mine was telling me about this in psychology, but I saw that sociology has this too. Individual study.
Okay.
How does that work? How would I be able to do that?
Oh, so this would be probably, I think I understand kind of the basic outline, is you basically find someone in the department who's willing to kind of